Hello, Miss Lois.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? I was having it didn't seem like it was letting me in. So I opened up the let people in before the host thing, and now it seems to be working. So yay.
Good. I had no problems. I didn't even have to put in the, what was it I was trying to put in?
The password?
No, I didn't even get that far. I didn't even put in the meeting ID.
Yeah, I think I canceled those things.
Okay.
Okay, hang on. Let me call Shulamit and see if I can help her. I'm going to mute my audio so you don't have to listen.
Oh, that's all right. I'm just doing other things. I just turned it on to make sure it worked.
So now my picture is on.
And your audio.
Yeah.
And now if you want to.
I know.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
Here she is.
Oh, she's.
Hi, Joan. I can see you and hear you.
Hello. That means I have to mute myself. Hi, Lois. How are you doing?
I'm doing well.
You're hiking every day?
Every day because Jeffrey's home. So the two of us go out. I'm so lucky to have a spouse that wants to do the same thing I do.
I walk around the pond, and I don't know if you know, but in front of Fraser Meadow is
Oh,
a very nice.
I've walked that.
Yeah, and I'm about 2 blocks from it, so it's a mile by the time I do the whole thing. Hi.
Oh, okay.
Hi, Lisa.
Hello. I was on trying to help somebody get in. Hi, Rabbi.
Oh, here comes the
Hannah.
Rabbi and I guess we should mute ourselves. So
Yes, we're going to want everybody to mute themselves. Hi, Nina.
Can do that.
Hi,
Lisa.
Sharon. How are you?
Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Good day.
Okay, okay, here comes Susan. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Lisa. I like your hair.
Thank you. Rabbi, you have your video turned off, so we can't see you.
Not yet, but soon.
Okay, that's great. Okay, and the rest of us need to mute our microphones. Does everybody know how to do that?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So we'll get started in a few minutes. We'll just give another 2 minutes for Muriel to join us. And I'm recording this for those people who are having trouble getting in or who want to see it but couldn't make it today. Is it okay if I share that, Rabbi?
Sounds good. Lisa, how is this? How is the sound?
I think it's good, and everybody can turn theirs up on their own. So I'm going to mute me now, and welcome Rabbi Firestone to our book club. Unfortunately, everyone wasn't able to get the book, and we have relaxed the rules for today because everybody wanted to listen to you. Usually you have to read the book to come to the meeting, but I know a lot of people weren't, including myself, weren't able to get it. So I'm going to turn it over to you and I'm going to,
Okay.
everybody will happy that I'm being muted.
Thank you, Lisa. Hello, everybody. Many of you I know. Hello. It's wonderful to see you. And I'm hoping that our beloved Muriel can make it on too. She's the one who did the footwork. Should we give her a little call, perhaps, Lisa, do you think? Or it's still 12:29. Maybe let's
I'm
wait
sure
till
that I will hear
12:30.
from her if she's having a problem. I'm leaving my phone on and she's
Okay.
saying that the password didn't work.
Okay.
So I'm going to try and fix that. Try and figure.
And I'll say in the meantime, the book, Wounds into Wisdom, is available on ebook very easily now. Amazon is, because it's a non-essential service, is taking a long time. So about 3 weeks to, or you can order it, but it's about 3 weeks. It's not, that's ridiculous. We're so used to everything coming so quickly. So I suggest you just get it on ebook if you can, if you have a Kindle or if you get it on your tablet. And if not, I can put one in the mail to you and hand engrave it. I will write a little personal note to you or to whoever is receiving it, and I can send it out. I'm sending them out all the time. So just let me know when I always give my author's book rate. So that's very inexpensive. So I hate to start without Muriel. Let's see if we can help her. Oh, she's on the phone. Okay, good. She did a lot of work to get this going, and I know her husband hasn't been well, and you just wanted to give her kavod and wait for her. I'm sorry we're not together biting into delicious bagels and lox this morning, or this noon hour, and I hope everybody's well. Probably everyone who's on is not, God forbid, that hasn't had any brushes with the virus. So put your thumbs up if you're well, or thumbs down if you're suffering. Lois, I'm not seeing. Are you? Oh, you're a thumbs up. Okay, good. Joan, how are you? You're outside. We should all be outside on this gorgeous day. Lisa, what did she say?
For some reason, she's having trouble getting in. She's the second person that's had a difficult time. I told her to keep trying, but we were going to get started. I have no idea why some people are able to get in and some people aren't. I had a problem. I'm glad I started early.
Well, I'll tell you what I've done in that case, go down, if you're the host, Lisa, go down to participants on the bottom of your menu. Sometimes people are waiting in the dockets and you have to let them in.
Oh yeah, no, I have a little, it pops up and tells me.
Okay.
Because I've got all my, oh wait, here comes Miriam. I'm in checking everybody in because I did a waiting room to hopefully avoid any Zoom bombing. Hi, Miriam.
Hi, happy you could make it.
So we're going to get started. If everybody mutes themselves, I can see, Hannah, you're not muted. But it's probably pretty quiet at your house. There you go. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so
You know
much,
how to
Lisa.
mute yourself? There you go. Perfect. Thank you.
Great. Okay, well, I'm happy to be here and sad not to see you all in person where we can rub shoulders and share good food. But this is second best. And I appreciate the Hadassah. I appreciate this group of well-read, highly intelligent, literate women asking me to come and share my journey and share a little bit about this book. Wounds into Wisdom is the product of, I would say, probably 10 to 12 years of work, thinking, research. It's the bug in me that got me to go back to do my doctoral work in about almost 10 years ago. And that's not true. Yes, 10 years ago, 2010. And I will start by giving you a little bit of an outline of what was that bug, what was the impetus to write the book. I want to tell some stories from it and around it, and then speak for about 20-30 minutes, and then open up. We'll unmute people, and or Lois or Lisa will unmute you. We can have a great discussion. That's really where the life is, and you can ask questions, and we'll get more specific. So the question that was the impetus for this book, that niggled at me for so long, is what is in our Jewish psyche, our Jewish psychology, that I know so well from being a rabbi for 27 years and a psychologist for about 35 years. What is in the Jewish psychology that promotes certain kinds of behaviors, both incredibly positive, resilient, noble values, loyal, and profoundly wise, as well as behaviors that are troubling. In my rabbinate, doing pastoral care with many, many Jews, as well as in my psychotherapy practice, I noticed a very common denominators, we could say, of, let me turn my phone off, to common denominators of troubling symptoms that had to do with anxiety, a feeling of not belonging in the world, a sense of tremulousness or shame. And when I went to Israel and did human rights work there, I felt it profoundly. And I started asking the question, what is in our psyche? Of course, I knew a lot about Jewish history. I knew a lot about our trauma legacy. And I started to see that trauma acts on individuals in a certain way, but on collective groups, on ethnicities, on nations, also in similar ways. Whole ethnicities can be reservoirs for deep pain. That's not going to be a surprise for anybody. But also, that what was very surprising when I started to study and research was that the same symptomology that I knew about and had studied for PTSD and individual trauma, and I'll define my terms in a moment, was active in entire groups. And I felt it in Israel. I felt it also in the diaspora, working with Jewish populations. So first of all, let's just say, I'll define my terms, because trauma is a word that's bantered about a lot right now, or has been for years. And that's because trauma science is coming to the fore, and we're able to, with the help of fMRIs, it's a functional MRI, that's a neuromagnetic examination of the brain. We can see what fires in the brain when we are in a post-trauma state. And so we know a lot more about trauma. Is very simply defined as any life experience that comes at us too fast, too soon, too much. That's Resmaa Menachem's very simple definition. He's an African-American traumatologist, a colleague of mine, but we could just say any life experience that overwhelms our abilities to integrate it. And each and every one of us has had that experience, whether it's someone falling off their bike, or someone rear-ending us, or much worse, 9/11, or getting terrible news, where we literally lose our reins. We are no longer the master of our house. We are bowled over, and our abilities to integrate and to metabolize what is happening in the here and now are overwhelmed. That's a good working lay definition of trauma. And then we come to a whole new field of trauma, which is what got me absolutely fascinated and intrigued, which is intergenerational, or let's start with a collective trauma, when an entire nation or an ethnicity, it could be a neighborhood, or it could be it could be a religion also, as we have experienced as Jews, that where the facts on the ground overwhelm our sensibilities and we can't integrate what is coming down. Now, in studying collective trauma, we see that, like I said, the same symptomology is prevalent as in individuals, and I'll go over those symptoms because they're very, very fascinating for all of us. But let me say, give you one more definition now, and that's intergenerational trauma. Intergenerational trauma is when the extreme life experiences of our ancestors, of the people who came before us, are unmetabolized, and they are transmitted, they are transferred to younger generations. And it's a very important concept, because now there is an entire field studying intergenerational trauma legacies. And the trauma legacies, again, some of this is just simply intuitive. We know that if a grandmother or a parent or a relative, a forebear, their life was cut short in the ghetto, or their life was cut short at a concentration camp, or they were deported, or they died in childbirth, and their little baby is left to foster care. All of these terrible and extreme life occurrences that happen and have happened, in particular to our ethnicity and our nation, our religion, our group. Those are very hard to metabolize on the ground. Things that are coming down so fast and furious that we cannot metabolize. It's like food that cannot be digested. And we know what happens when things get clogged up. It's like one psychologist I heard say, it's like frozen life. Life freezes. It's not digested. And so there's just a block. And now there is scientific data that shows that there's a transfer of these legacies, these trauma legacies, and through the generations, there's a transference into the new generation. And there's Muriel. Hi.
Hi.
Okay.
Finally.
It's wonderful to see you.
Well, it's wonderful to see you too. I am so sorry.
Don't be sorry. We're just happy to have you now.
You're not the only one who's having a difficult time. We've gotten started, so we're going to just ask you to mute your microphone so we can keep listening.
How do I do that?
I think we can do that.
Down to the left corner, it's usually in the left, and click on it as mute.
Or the upper right-hand corner of your frame.
Oops, it disappeared.
Lisa,
You have to move your mouse and that'll make it come back.
Not there.
All right, well.
Lisa, you can do that as the host.
I can do that as a host. I just
go down to participants and you can do that.
Yeah.
So Muriel, we've been started just giving some definitions. And so far we have talked about what trauma is. And I'm going to ask the class to tell me what trauma is. And you don't have to, I'm really not putting you on the hot spot here. But trauma is any overwhelming experience, life experience that we cannot integrate in the moment as it's happening. And sometimes it occurs that we never do. Those memory fragments are too intense to be reintegrated into our psyche. And so we're talking about intergenerational trauma when this happened in generations past. And, as Jews, we always say dor lador. Midor lador, nagid gadlacha. And from generation to generation, we sing God's praises. It is also true that we hand down different kinds of legacies to our children, to our forebears. And this is the best advertisement ever for doing our personal work. for looking at things that bother us, for looking at legacies that are that make us cringe or collapse us, or that make us ashamed. Because what science is showing now, and now I'm going to throw another big term at you, the field of epigenetics is now showing, it's about 20 years old, it's a relatively new field of science that shows that our genetics, our genetic makeup does not change when terrible things happen to us. However, epi is on top of our genes. The methylated strands on top of our genes are affected. And that means that the gene expression is actually changed when we are deeply impacted by the historical events that are happening in our lifetimes. So I'm going to wait to hear from you how much science you want to go into. I'm not going to go into different, though it's fascinating. Epigenetics started in animal behavior labs and then went into human behavior. And there are amazing Jewish epigeneticists like Dr. Rachel Yehuda, who's the head of neuroscience and psychiatry at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York City. She herself is.
Oh, there she is. There she is. You want to hear Rabbi Firestone?
You hear it?
Wait a minute.
Hey.
Hi, Dubins.
Yay! Hi.
Dubins.
We made it. We made it. It was not easy.
Bravo.
We're glad you're here. Now we need to ask you to mute your microphone.
Oh, okay.
And mute.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So Dr. Rachel Yehuda is herself. She was born in Israel. She's the daughter of a rabbi. She was born, and then she moved to Cleveland, where she lived in a second-generation Holocaust survivor neighborhood. And she grew up, went to medical school, and became fascinated by the same thing I'm fascinated with, is the trauma legacy of second and third and now fourth generation trauma survivors. Is there a residue? Is there intergenerational residue from these extreme life experiences? And she has done amazing research. Anyone who's interested, I'm happy to send you a bibliography of books and essays and things that you can just click online and read about, that show that there is indeed an epigenetic residue of extreme life situations. Now, okay, so we've proven that, and these are things that we know intuitively anyway. We know that a bubby or a grandmother who woke up screaming in the middle of the night, who lived with us, that's going to affect small children, and they're going to grow up with that terror of midnight screamings and what was that about. And there's all kinds of stories in Wounds into Wisdom about just that, because what happened is that I became fascinated by it. I went to Israel to do my doctoral research in this, and worked with in narrative research and interviewing scores of people there who had come through all kinds of Jewish trauma, Jewish historical trauma, we call it. That is the kind of life residue that comes from the things that happen because we're Jewish. So it's not only Holocaust, but it's also being kicked out of Iran in the early 80s, or Russian Jews, what happened to them, or Israeli Jews who have lived there for 10 generations, but whose children have been killed in suicide bombings, or Jewish Israelis who serve in Sahal, who serve in the Israeli Defense Forces, and they are deeply traumatized by what they've seen and what they have done in service to their country. So all of these different kinds of Jewish trauma, not only Holocaust, and not only Ashkenazic Jews, by the way, I want to say that's most of us, I'd say 95% or 90% of us are Ashkenazic Jews. And so we tend to forget that Sephardic Jews or Mizrahi Jews have gone through their tremendous traumas as well, in racial discrimination, religious discrimination in their countries, in Northern Africa and all through the Middle East, and were persecuted too. So I researched all kinds of Jews and all kinds of Jewish historical trauma. And then I asked the question, well, who has made it through? It's a big question. Okay, so we have trauma. We know that. That's not rocket science. And we know that we have intergenerational trauma legacies, the residue of our ancestors, our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, residue of unmetabolized life experiences. But then what do we do about it? Right? It's okay, so what? Like, let's move on. Let's do something good with this. And so I asked the question, who out there has done the hard work of metabolizing their ancestral legacies? Who has turned to face these hard things, the things that happen in their own life, like losing children to suicide bombings, for instance, or losing children in military snipings, for instance, or other terrible things that happen to us. And that's one kind of trauma that's here and now in our lifetimes. And then the trauma legacy. What does that look like? And who has moved through these experiences? And I was able to contact about 20 amazing people and families who had defied, we could say, defied the normative trauma residue profile. So the normative trauma, PTSD, is we know what that looks like. We don't feel safe in the world. We have agitation. Let me talk about the trauma residues first, because you might be able to actually identify them with people that you know in your family or in your communities. Well, the first one is, and this is worldwide, this is not Jewish trauma. This is for everybody who suffers from trauma. Now, there is probably across the board, both individual as well as collective trauma, there is such a thing as called dissociation. How many of you know what, have you ever heard that word, or dissociation? Dissociation literally means to be emotionally numbed by, it's like we get frozen in time. Something just goes numb. Now, dissociation or emotional numbness is a life-saving mechanism. We have to do that because we get overwhelmed with our experiences or with what's going on historically for us. And so we just put it on hold so that we can call 911, or we can function, or we can pack to get out of town because we're being thrown out of, or we're being moved to the ghetto, or we're being moved again onto the train, or all of these things were so intense. So dissociation is something that happens for any, let's say, sexual abuse victim, anyone who's been violated in any way, or robbed, or all the terrible things that can happen. Dissociation gives us a kind of a shield so that we can function and not be 24/7 involved in what happened to us. It's a very brilliant human biological mechanism. The trick is, however, that if you stay dissociated, if you stay numb, you are not fully alive. There's something that shuts down in you. You can't feel pain, but you also can't feel joy. And you're at a simcha and you just are kind of like checked out. You can't feel the joy of your children. You can't feel the joy of your grandchildren. So dissociation is about moving through dissociation. It means integrating those trauma fragments back into the psyche, remembering what happened to you, and moving through the grief and moving through the feelings of what happened to you, the horror, and moving through the eye of the needle. So dissociation is the first one. The next one I think we all know as Jews, and that's hyperarousal. Again, this is not a Jewish symptom. This is a universal symptom. It's a nervous system symptom that happens to preserve our lives. Hyperarousal is simply the nervous system saying you are not safe, you are under threat, the shoe may fall at any moment, you need to keep hyper aroused, you need to keep hyper vigilant. It's another word for this symptom, this trauma symptom. And that makes us fast on our feet. It makes us smart and street smart and savvy. It makes us ingenious. It makes us ready to move. It makes us great at problem solving and troubleshooting and survival. And what does it not make us good at? We're always on a hair trigger. Our nervous system never relaxes. So let's just take a deep breath right now, because just even going through these symptoms, just learning about this kind of gets us ratcheted up, and it's stressful. So hyperarousal says stay in stress because you're not safe in this world. And because we've had the kind of history that Jews have had for so many, not only from the Holocaust and pogroms, but for centuries behind, for centuries we've gone through it. So it's deeply embedded in our epigenetics to be hyper aroused, to have our nervous systems ratcheted up. And that makes us more impatient, it makes us more stressed, and epigenetically, it makes us less resilient. When little things happen, we think they're big things. So all of us who are in the, all of us, all of the world now in the virus culture, in the COVID-19 culture, some of us are mellow and some of us are extremely ratcheted up. And by that, I mean our nervous systems, our stress hormones are flowing. So we need to learn how to take care of ourselves. And that's what my work is about, is how can we ratchet down, so to speak? How can we learn to do the kind of self-care that slows us down? How many of us, for instance, were raised in families that said, slow down, honey, relax, everything's going to be okay. Good. I want to see hands, because that's not a Jewish trait. And as I work with Jews around the country, it's more prevalent where parents were rushing us to get certain places and to hurry up and to look good and to get to school and to do well in school and not to fall behind and da 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 da. There was a kind of tempo around achievement and around look behind you at all times and not necessarily to trust the world around us. There's also another symptom that I'll talk about today, and that I discuss all of this in lay terms in the book Wounds into Wisdom, which I hope you'll get, and that is kind of a sense of shame. Now, this is a complex one, which we'll just touch on. Why would I feel ashamed if something bad happened to me? It doesn't make sense, right? If a car hit me, God forbid, or someone violated my boundaries and no fault of my own, why would I feel ashamed? But this is another crazy kind of PTSD symptom that we find both in individuals as well in groups, that when things happen to us, we feel responsible. We know that from children. Child psychology, parents get divorced or separated and the children feel guilty and ashamed. We know that women, God forbid, who, if somebody assaults them, assaults their boundaries or sexually or in any way, oftentimes women feel ashamed, even though the woman didn't do anything. So this is I think, again, a life-saving mechanism, because what happens when we feel like this is that we take ourselves into isolation. We take ourselves into the cave, in a sense, to lick our wounds. And so isolation and shame and feeling not quite part of the world and wary of the world is actually, if you think about it, a life-saving mechanism, right? Because when you're traumatized, you can't be in the flow. You need to heal yourself. You need to pull in. But as we know, if you stay in, if you stay feeling that's unsafety, if you stay feeling ashamed, then if you stay isolated, then we get fixated. Our narrative becomes fixated and we can't as easily move back in and find our resilience again. And that's why many trauma victims are re-victimized. And it takes us to the fourth symptom, which is the inadvertent tendency to engage the trauma, to enact the trauma or to re-injure ourselves or others. So all of this is in the book. I'm just touching on that to say those 4 symptoms. So there's numbing out, there's hyperarousal, there's isolation and shame, and the inadvertent tendency to reenact our injuries. Now we can see that on a solo level, on a family level, and on a national level. And we won't get into Israel today, but we can see some of these post-trauma legacies showing up in how we choose our policies in Israel. And to stay isolated, to stay not drawing in friendly allies, to stay in a kind of a knee-jerk rather than diplomatic policy standpoint. But we can see it also in family legacies as well, where families have. I'll talk about my own family because this is not academic for me. It's from my family, and that's maybe a good place to stop. I'll come in for a landing, and then we can talk and ask questions. This was a fascination academically and in my intellectual research, but it came from my own autobiography and a family that was deeply traumatized, but I didn't know it. So I grew up with a mother who I knew had a German accent. I knew she got out of Germany in 1939. That wasn't a secret. She came out on the Kinder transport by the skin of her teeth. She made it out to England and then Canada and then the US. But what I never knew until my first book came out in my early 40s, I never knew that all of her cousins, except for one, all of her aunts and uncles were murdered in Nazi Germany, in Nazi Europe. And when my first book came out, With Roots in Heaven, a strange call came to me with a guy with a strange accent. He introduced himself as Ziggy, and he said, "I am your cousin. I'm calling from Melbourne, Australia," in this crazy accent. And I was sure it was a crank call. I was literally about to hang up the phone. And he said, "Don't hang up the phone. I have things to tell you about your family that you don't know. I just read your book." How my book had made it to Australia, I'll never know. But cousin Ziggy was the only cousin who made it out. He escaped the labor camp in Slovakia and made his way to Australia, of all places. So here he talked, and then finally he made Aliyah, and we became good friends before he died. So my mother never told her story, and my father, who was a good Jewish boy from Brooklyn, was drafted, or I think he enlisted. He knew German. He knew to speak German, and he was enlisted and deployed on a bomb detection squadron, deployed to all the most devastated places in Germany. And he found himself in April 1945 in Bergen-Belsen as it was being liberated. He was already married to my mom, and they already had a child, a baby. But he was deployed, and he saw at Bergen-Belsen he came as it was being liberated by the British troops, and as a young man, I think he saw things. I know he saw things that were absolutely unseeable, and never spoke of them. And after he died, cleaning out his file cabinets, we found a file full of photographs that he had taken as this 22-year-old man. And he showed the things that he saw that he literally couldn't digest. He took pictures of that unmetabolized visuals, images, and of an acre and a half of corpses, and the kinds of things that no person should ever see, let alone a young person. And so after his death, I started to connect the dots. And after in midlife, I started to see, oh my God, my parents parented the way they did. They acted the way they did, with their tempers and their dogma and their flying off the handle about certain topics, because they were trauma victims, because they were trauma survivors. and they had gone through these things. And that's what, that's my story, that the autobiographical element that spurred this research was because I had to find out, what is it in us? How can one heal from these trauma legacies? How can I heal from these trauma legacies? How can my people heal from these trauma legacies? So that, with that, I will, I think I will close my talk. And Lisa, I think we'll unmute everybody, and, or unmute, maybe just raise your hand if you have a question. Would that work?
Everyone has muted themselves, so they
Okay.
can, except for Alma, who I will. Everyone else, I think everyone else muted themselves. So I'll let people just do what they want. I saw Muriel's hand up, so Muriel, why don't you start?
And you can, everyone, you can put yourself on speaker view, and then you can see who's asking the question. I don't hear Muriel.
You're still muted. Oh, you were the one that couldn't find it. Okay, hang on, let me unmute you.
Okay,
Yeah.
you can hear me now? Okay. Also in your book, Tirza, you mentioned that the therapist has to take care of him or herself also. And as I was reading about your interviews, I wondered how you were able to keep yourself sane after listening to these horror tales.
That's a good question. I, you know, as a therapist, I've been listening to many, many, many stories, the good, the bad, the ugly, for, 35 years now. So I'm used to all kinds of things. And I'm also used to hearing about trauma and post-trauma. But I think that there's a whole art of self-care, of getting very grounded and getting healthy in your body, and taking enough time for yourself that helps to ground yourself. And the other thing is that I pray and I ask for a larger help than my own self, because I feel like we, whether or not you're a believer, I'm a believer, but I know that there are bigger forces, there are invisible forces out there that are who are watching over us and begging us to do our work. The Talmud says, there's this great little tale, many of you I know have heard this tale, that every leaf of grass, it's a metaphor, every leaf of grass is created with its own little angel who is standing by it, yelling, grow, grow, grow. I love that little story, because it tells us, I think the rabbis are trying to teach us that we have help. We have invisible help. We have guardians. We have our ancestors. I do believe that the neshamas, the souls of our ancestors, are still present with us. And as we do this work of healing ourselves and our lineage, we have help that are forces that are helping us grow and heal and grow beyond our trauma legacies. So it's a great question.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Anybody
Else?
Yes.
Lois, please.
Hi. I really was very surprised. I did finish the book. I tried to, I wanted the physical book, but that wouldn't come till next week. So I did have to read it. I did have to read it on the Kindle. But as a scientist, I was, or a former scientist, I was fascinated by epigenetics. So I would very much like the additional information on things to read for people who might know a little but not too much.
That's great. And there's some really complicated neuroscience.
Yeah.
And that's, I had to comb through that, but I really gravitated toward more lay articles. I'd be happy to make my bibliography available to you if I can get, if people are interested.
So I probably could find it in the at the back of the book. I didn't.
That would be hundreds, but I have a one-page with links that I could send it to you electronically. Then you could just click on the links and read Yehuda or read these great articles. There's fascinating, just fascinating, the science. And it is, I had a correspondence with Dr. Yehuda before I sent my manuscript in, just to make sure it was kosher in her.
Oh, okay. Mhm.
And because I'm not a scientist, and she took issue with some things, and I think that and so I changed some things. She's very, I think that she's gotten bonked a little bit by other scientists for making this material too facile. And in other words, she kept toning my language down. There's evidence of, we think we know, but she said she stressed that we have a lot of evidence now, and I'm going to give an example of this. It's much more in the animal behavior than it is in humans, because it's so hard. Like mice, for instance, generate, in a matter of months, whereas human generations are 20 to 30 years. So it's harder to get that data. But there is data, there is human data, but the most, really the biggest control test was literally thousands, hundreds and thousands of descendants of a historical event. This is not a Jewish test, called the Dutch Hunger Winter. And it was the winter of 1944 and 1945 that the Nazis surrounded Scandinavia, and food couldn't get into Holland. And so for those months, people were literally starving to death. They were literally dropping down on the streets from malnutrition, from not having
Yeah,
enough.
that's when they ate the bulbs.
They ate bulbs, they would eat grass, they would eat anything, exactly. So everyone knew then that the babies that were in utero during that winter were going to be in trouble, right? I mean, that they knew that in the 40s. But what they didn't know was proven in the 90s and 2000s, that the grandchildren, in particular the female grandchildren of those mothers, and I think also the next generation, the great-grandchildren, were much more likely to have hypertension, heart disease, obesity, and also bipolarity and depression. So you can, now that's a physical, there's physical proof on that, but each of us know in our own families that there's evidence, to use Rachel Yehuda's word, there's evidence of these, if you come from a trauma legacy, maybe you didn't, if you were in America.
No, I'm one of these people that the only thing I'm afraid of is what hasn't happened to me yet.
Wow. Okay. And Lois, just say about your background, or your
I have a PhD in molecular biology from Harvard.
Yes, I knew you were a high caliber scientist, but I'm talking about your grandparents. When did they come over?
My mother's mother was born in New York City.
Okay, so you're one of the lucky ones. Your ancestors made it out early,
Right.
And so you're and it shows. You're hale and hearty, and you got all your faculties. But we can tell, there is, for those of us who come from Holocaust backgrounds or from displacement backgrounds, there are these residues that we can tell in our personalities and in our children. And so it's just, it's fascinating.
Well, I think that's why I was so fascinated by your book. The other thing that fascinated me was about the Parent Circle Families Forum. And you touched on it in the book, but it sounded like it really was something that had major effects on the people who participated.
Major effects. This is one of the great NGOs, one of the great nonprofits in Israel now that's been going on for, I don't know, some years now, almost 20 years, where Israeli and Palestinian families have come across the Green Line to commiserate in their respective losses. Everyone who's lost children, either by sniping or by suicide bombings, instead, and this defies the trauma, normative trauma symptoms. And this is a great example, Lois. It's normal to, when someone hurts someone in your family and you, to pull in, to isolate, to hate, to want to take vengeance. And one of the stories I tell is a story of Rami. His 14-year-old daughter Smadar was blown up in a suicide bombing in Jerusalem, and his story is that he tells us that he was like a rabid animal for about a year. He was rageful. He couldn't work. He couldn't see straight. He wanted to kill people. He was just he was a mess. He said people couldn't be around him. And then something happened, and I won't give it away because it's one of the profound moments in the book. And the key turned in the lock, and he was able to shift from that normative symptomology into this incredible. He became he is now the executive director of the Bereavement Family Forum, along the co-director. There's always a Palestinian and an Israeli Jew, and they travel all over the world together. I'd love to get them to Boulder. And they tell how these people have befriended each other and stepped out of the normal hatred of the other to befriend each other and to help each other heal from these horrible losses. So
Before we go too much further, would you make a note? If you send me that one-page bibliography, I will share it with everybody in the book club.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Anyone else want to share a comment or a question?
I see Hannah.
Hi.
Sharon.
So the opposite side of the coin, if you will, for being traumatized, if you've been through such a situation, or if your family has been, which was the case in my case, is resilience.
Great.
My parents are both Holocaust survivors, and I was actually born in a displaced person camp in Poland a couple of years after the war, until they could get to Canada, as it turned out. And growing up, I mean, it sounds like a lack of empathy on my parents' part, but it really wasn't. So if you would complain about something, the comeback was, whatever is going bad in your life was worse than mine at your age. So you have nothing to complain about. And while it sounded mean at the time, it also led me to be what I think to be a fairly resilient person in dealing with things.
Amazing. Say a little bit more about your parents. How did they get out, and where did they go?
Independent of one another, they didn't meet until after the war. They both managed to flee to Russia, where they were arrested and sent to Siberia.
Oh, God.
Came back to Poland after the war and found very little family at that point that had survived. And eventually made their way to Toronto, where my father had a brother.
How old were you when you came to Canada?
I was 10 months old.
Oh, wow. So you had no memories of that?
No. But, growing up in an immigrant household, because my parents obviously couldn't speak English, and we lived, I guess, the part of Toronto that we comparable to the Lower East Side of New York. Pretty much everybody was a survivor. So from a very young age on, when my parents' friends got together, they were exchanging war stories. And as children, we heard this. There were no secrets. You heard about my mother's friend whose child was killed in front of her, and then her husband was killed in front of her. So these were stories that I grew up with.
Yeah, exactly. I just recently met a woman similarly, probably around the same age, whose parents somehow fled to Lima, Peru. I didn't know that there was a community there, but they went there, and she said that she grew up on her aunts, and they all came to Peru, to Lima, and she grew up, and they told the stories in Yiddish. And they told horrendous stories, and she was always on their knees, and they would sit in circles telling their war stories. And she she didn't know what they were, but she felt the feeling of it. And later on, she found out what the stories were. But she said that she felt as a young child, the angst, like she absorbed the angst of her parents and uh, the the residue, for lack of a better word. And I wonder if you ever felt that you absorbed the terrible things that happened to them, the feelings.
Oh, sure. I mean, my mother, more than my father, was very open about her experiences. My father didn't want to talk about it a whole lot, but he would be one who would wake up screaming during the night,
Okay.
which was, terrifying to us kids growing up.
That must have
Until we realized what it was about, and it wasn't that it was something from the past that was causing this terrors. They also made it pretty clear that you cannot trust people who aren't Jewish. I mean, that was one of their lessons to us.
Uh-huh. Has that lived on in you?
No, it has not. It has not, because I have friends who I think are very good people and wonderful people, in fact, who are not Jewish, obviously. But
Okay.
that was their experience. I mean, that was based on their growing up.
Good, but let me slow us down here for a moment, because Hannah is sharing something very important. And in my teaching, teaching people from around the world now, that is a very important move that you made that you may not even be aware of, where our parents learned a lesson: don't trust a goy. That's what I grew up with too. And the goyim will slit your throat at the drop of a hat if they have a chance. Terrible, terrible. I don't know what to call it. Terrible lessons that my parents gave me, and that's how I started out life. But what Hannah has done is turn to face the lesson and say, actually, evidence shows that that's not true, and so I'm going to dismiss that or reject it. At some unconscious level, you've had to do that. And I don't even know if you were aware that you were doing that, where you had to turn and say, that was true for you, but it's not true for me. The evidence, it's really scientifically, the evidence in my life shows me otherwise. Thank God. So that's a beautiful move that you made.
Well, I think it took me a while to get there. It wasn't an automatic thing. It was a gradual thing.
Yeah.
I know at one of our book club meetings, I think it was Nina, and I forget the book we were discussing, was saying that she does this thing in her head. What is it? Who would hide me if I needed to be hidden?
Yeah.
And on the other hand, I don't know if who would hide me. So it's that double-edged thing, as you want to trust, but on the other hand, you have to be mindful also.
Yes. Good. But that's not an automatic behavior. Mindfulness is very different than automaticity. So that's great. I love your story. Thank you, Hannah.
Aaron? Then Muriel.
So what Hannah was just talking about at the end there dovetails in what I was going to say. Is I love how you talked about disidentifying as the victim, because we could be really stuck in that. I know one of the first things when Trump was elected as president is we made sure that our kids got passports, and we could all, God forbid, could leave if we needed to. I'd never experienced any overt anti-Semitism, yet it was in my DNA to protect that way.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. That's such a great comment. I think it's really important to bring this into the present tense. How many of us, in 2017 in August, with the Charlottesville episode, with the, watching on the news, the neo-Nazis with their torches, and as a rabbi, I got so many calls. I'm sure every rabbi in town did. And people were saying, I barely identify as a Jew, and I'm freaked out. And nothing has ever happened to me like that, or my family. I'm not a Holocaust survivor, but I feel like I'm in 1933 Germany again. So how many of us have felt those things that have, more recently? And that's what the science would say of intergenerational trauma healing is that those things live in us, even if they're not in our direct bloodline. Jung calls it the cultural unconscious that we share, like that all Jews, for instance, share a kind of a reservoir of our history. And so we feel these things. And Sharon, were you in, is that in your ancestry?
No, it's not.
Okay.
Mhm.
And I know up until probably the last 10 years or so, I always had this itch about just feeling planted wherever I was living. And personally, I've never experienced, I mean, we moved when I was 13. But other than that, there is nothing that I know of in my known lineage of why I would not feel grounded where I lived. And I am a trauma therapist, and I was at a trauma training for brain spotting, which is related to EMDR. And the man who's discovered brain spotting, David Grand, said somebody else was actually up in front of the room for the demonstration. And she said she experienced this. And David said a lot of Jews have that same experience.
Yeah. And it's not rational. It doesn't make rational sense. Epigenetics makes rational sense that if my grandmother had it or my great grandmother, that I would have the residue. But to not be connected, I think that there's an uncanniness to this work, and there's a mysterious quality to it. We may never get to the bottom of it, but it's fascinating, and we have to take care of ourselves. So you get passports for your children, and you read the news, and try not to be, I think, too, you try to do good things for your nervous system, so we're not always like this. I grew up in a house that was always like this. The shoe's going to drop at any moment, and that was because of, I realized later, what my parents had gone through. Yeah, thank you, Sharon.
Muriel, and then Miriam.
How about me?
Excuse me. Muriel, I have to unmute you just a second. There you go.
I'm referring back to what Hannah was saying. The other side of that story is if someone came to me, with this immigration, so many Hispanic people under the gun, who would I hide?
Good. Thank you for saying that. And that's really the question that's hanging in the air. And I didn't want to get us off topic, so I didn't ask that, but it was hanging in my brain, Muriel, that, what does our history, what is it, who would hide us? Would we go out on a limb? I've thought of that so often. Would I go out on a limb to take in Guatemalan friends who are desperate right now? I think that's so good. And Joan, you might want to answer that question, but I think Miriam was next. So could you just hold your thought? Good.
Miriam and then Joan.
Go ahead,
A little bit of
Miriam.
a comment on from before is, I lived in Skokie when they were, threatening to march and all that, and the Nazis and the neo-Nazis, and it didn't really seem to press a lot of buttons. You did some, but not a lot. But with Charlottesville, I was more buttons are pressed, and I think the difference is the president, to be honest, is that because he seemed to give an okay or backhanded okay for this kind of action. That was not happening. I mean, we were having demonstrations against the letting them march in Skokie, and then so the people were on your side. In this case, when you think the president's not on your side, you're really in trouble. And I think that's it. But the other things that bothered me in the book is that a number of things, like these soldiers that, and I know that they're very young when they go into the service and how some of them even felt that they changed themselves and were not, could have become more brutal or that if circumstances aroused. There was one that was raised Orthodox and was in the service, and he didn't even like what he was seeing in himself. And then you talked about the school where lecture was given, and actually this high school students, and a lot of them, it's really only the majority, were very anti-Palestinian, and it even seemed from your book that the principal of the school was too. So I wonder, how is this playing in Israel even now? I mean, you've got these groups that are trying to get together. I mean, there's other groups besides the trauma groups that try to bring the Israelis and the Palestinians together there. But how much of an impact are they really having? Because it seemed that you also said that some of these people who told her stories about the service and that got a lot of negative feedback.
Oh yeah, you're right that it's about the government and the leadership, because that gives from it really is true that from the highest level we get our permissions, and as they say, the dog whistles. I think that right now the groups of people who are, for instance, the combatants for peace or the breaking the silence, these groups of people who are saying that listen guys, there's a moral red line here. There's a Jewish ethical line, and we have to be so careful. We want to defend ourselves, but we can't cross this line. That they're not doing well right now. It's a very right-wing government. It's a very we don't know how Netanyahu will do in this joint venture with Gantz. It's the jury's out, we could say, but it is in a sense very much the trend in the world right now is much more toward hyper-nationalism and less toward the other. And that's Trump, and it's Viktor Orban in Hungary, and it's in Poland, and it's all through various countries. And Netanyahu also is fairly right wing. So those groups are not doing so well. I would say they have to really watch themselves, although they do get backing mostly from the diaspora, which causes more tension. So it's a very complicated situation there, but these poor soldiers, and as you said, Miriam, I heard that more than once where people said, I looked in the mirror and I didn't recognize myself. And then I knew, one of the chapters in the book, as some of you have read it, is, what turns the key? What's the awakening? And for many of these young men, and for women too, who were chayalot, looking in the mirror and saying, what am I becoming? Who am I? I can't recognize myself. I'm starting to become, just a knee-jerk kind of angry at the other, and I want to get the other, and I want to beat the other, or whatever they said, and I don't like myself. I don't recognize myself. And so that turned it for them. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Joan?
Yeah, I wanted to mention a book that our group had discussed. I think it by Nathan Englander, who is an American Jewish short story writer. Yes. And the name of the book had something to do with Anne Frank.
Yes.
And it was about two couples who get drunk over the course of a day, and then they start questioning each other whether they were all Jews, whether they would have hid Anne Frank. And it's the revelations and who you thought might have hid her and who you thought might not have hid her after spending an afternoon with these people was very thought-provoking. Anyway, I do recommend Nathan Englander. He's a wonderful writer. I wanted to thank you.
The name of the book is What We Mean When We Talk About Anne Frank. It's a really amazing story. Yeah, yeah. Go ahead. Sorry, John.
And his other short stories are very thought-provoking also. But I did want to thank you for the book. And I think it's so sad that so many people have passed away who were children to experience. I mean, I'm in my 80s, and it's a huge Holocaust community of the original survivors, but the children are still there. goodness there. And I hope they have an opportunity to find your. I and one came on the kin and lost his whole family cousin. And he had a really troubled life and a success, poor relationship with his children. But he forgave the Germans, which I found was very interesting. He said, you can't hate for 50 years. They had the community where he had grown up had invited him back, and other Jews who had been born into that community. I think that was done in Germany. It was a very common thing that these communities did a kind of repentance. So, but he never dealt with his feelings really. And the other man that I knew was Polish, and he lived in an underground bunker in a rural part of Poland for 15 months with 50 other Jews till the Russians liberated them. And he eventually got to this country. He married an Israeli who had been through the Holocaust. The marriage didn't work. I mean, people just carried on the wounds. And therefore, I'm very grateful, you know, that you've written this book. And I just hope when life is normal, you're back on your tours, talking and running workshops.
Thank you, Joan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Joan, I turned off your video for a minute because it seemed like you were using more bandwidth than you had. While you were talking, it was getting garbled. So if you want to turn it back on, for some reason I can't. I just wanted to let you know that that's why other people weren't seeing you.
That helped, Lisa. Thank you. That helped me hear her. Yeah, good.
I was hoping it would work.
It worked. Yeah.
There she is. She's back.
There she is.
I have a question.
We can't see Susan. She's turned off her.
Okay.
But we can hear you.
Okay. Well. Okay. I'm a little bit concerned about the expectations. I'm sure that everybody would like to get over falling into this pattern, not overreact, not have a sense of shame. But so how are people through therapy helped to integrate this experience?
Great question. Okay, is that your question? How are people helped to integrate? Well, therapy is only one way, but there's many ways. I've worked with second generation Holocaust survivor groups and now third generation Holocaust survivor groups. There's so much that can happen in a group like, for instance, your group is a very healing and therapeutic group. You know, no, it's not a Holocaust surviving group, but it is, you all have much in common, and reading together, there's something just therapeutic about coming together in groups. Therapy does, certainly. And there are also all kinds of ancestral healing groups. Some people that I'm working with now, I'm working with a very large groups of hundreds of people from around the world, so not just Jews. Many people are looking at their ancestral traditions and what their ancestors have gone through, the Irish potato famine and the Armenian genocide. And I see people whose ancestors have gone through incredible horrors, and studying together, doing practices together. I don't think most of them are in therapy, but they are reading together, studying together, and doing meditations of mindfulness and becoming more aware, as well as, and here's a tricky one I'm going to throw out, in their meditations to literally to